Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Armourer's Bench. Today I'm very pleased to be joined by author and journalist David Hambling, and he's joining us today to talk about the use of drones in Ukraine, which is a very big topic, but we'll try and cover what we can. So David, obviously drone sort of evolution has really ramped up and sped up with the conflict in Ukraine, but we've seen drone use for the last decade or so. What would you say are the more important aspects of drone use in Ukraine? Because we've got elements of situational awareness, reconnaissance, fire control for artillery, and then obviously we have also direct action. So we've seen lots of videos from Ukraine with small drones dropping munitions and that sort of thing. So which out of those would you say is probably the most significant broadly?
As a drone nerd, of course, I have to step in and say drones have been around for quite a lot longer than that, and go all the way back to about 1849. They're constantly being invented and then cancelled by militaries who really don't like them and then reinvented. And I think one of the interesting things about the Ukraine conflict is that it's not really the military who are being in charge of the drones and drone procurement. It's very much down at a low level. And that the vast majority of drones that we're seeing actually used by both sides have not been supplied via the normal procurement process, but many of them have actually been built or bought by volunteers, supporters, and groups who are helping the military. The most game-changing aspect of drone warfare in Ukraine has been in terms of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and in particularly in guiding artillery. And this is really down mainly to small consumer drones, typically the DJI Mavics series. In fact, both sides tend to call these little drones Mavics, even though a lot of them aren't, but that's now just become a generic term like Hoover or Fridge for these devices. So what these are little quadcopters costing in the region of $1,000, and they give you something like half an hour flight time out to a few kilometers range. And they take absolutely zero skill to operate because it's designed as a consumer product that any teenager can take out of the box and fly right there. Because the secret is the operator isn't really flying it. The thing flies itself. It can hover in a stable configuration and give you a perfectly level platform for shooting camera work from. So these really are very impressive, and it avoids obstacles automatically. And if you tell it where to go, it goes there. So these are amazingly easy to use, useful things. And it provides what soldiers have always wanted, which is a way of seeing into the next street, over the next hill, without having to put your head over the parapet. So this is the ideal platform for artillery observation, because if you're looking for targets as a ground observer, if it's among trees or among buildings or behind a ridge or a hill, you've got no chance. Whereas with a drone, you can actually see these things really easily. And the Ukrainians have some clever software which allows geolocation. So it means that they can actually get the exact grid reference of a target that the drone is looking at.
And is that something they've developed themselves?
Some clever software called Nettle. Yeah, they've. There's two key things here. One is a piece of software called Nettle, which is what allows an artillery observer or anyone else to use a drone feed to get an exact information about what is where on the ground. And the other one is this giant thing called Delta, which is the Ukrainian military situational awareness system, which takes in feeds from all sorts of intelligence and merges them together into a single view. So it really gives them an incredible amount of data about what's out there. So the upshot of this is that if you've got an artillery piece, which can be a gun, a mortar, or anything else, and a guy with a drone, you can find targets and drop shells onto them with incredible accuracy. And we've seen so many videos of indirect fire walking right onto individual tanks and other vehicles, which is really quite unusual. The Ukrainians reckon that it's increased the firepower of the artillery by a factor of 6 to 9. So it takes that many fewer shells to engage a target than it would just by normal fire. but it also allows them to find lots of targets that they wouldn't otherwise be able to engage. And what's interesting is seeing how this use of drone-directed artillery has filtered down to the very lowest levels. So you've got lots of individual weapons firing. And it's not just traditional artillery either. I've seen more videos of Ukrainian tanks firing indirectly than I have of them being actually used as tanks in direct fire. And they now claim to have established a new record for a tank-to-tank kill, which I think is 8 kilometers. And the video for this is online, and the Ukrainian tank is simply firing, at quite a high angle, and the Russian tank is sitting there with shells landing around it. No idea what's firing at it or from when. And it took them about 20 shots, but they killed the Russian tank with no return fire. And that is a bit game-changing. The Russians are starting to use that tactic as well, but they haven't got nearly as many drones available for it. And also this tactic, it's not being just used for standard artillery pieces. I've seen it being used
grenade
for
machine guns and that sort of thing, isn't it?
Yes, the AGS-17's using it. So, and you've literally got a bloke who's operating, who then he fires a burst into the air, and then the drone operator shows him the video. And a few seconds later, he sees where they all come down, and he says, "Okay, I'll just move it a bit to the left." And this means you've got this plunging fire, which is very effective against entrenchments and foxholes. That it wouldn't be otherwise. But they're using all sorts of things. They're using the old T-12 anti-tank guns are now being used in an indirect fire role. And there's the SPG-9s, the 73mm recoilless, again being used as indirect fire. And heavy machine guns as well. So again, it just means all you need is a...
I spoke to someone the other day in Ukraine, and he was asking about how to do indirect fire with an M2 Browning on a soft mount. And we talked about, historic examples of that and how it was done. And obviously within that, factoring in a drone for fall of shot makes the whole process so much more easy. So obviously it's going from all the way from, MLRS down to heavy machine gun. So this is such a wide breadth of, drone corrected fire. And as you mentioned there, that the Russians have apparently have a significant disadvantage in the number of drones available and the types of drones available. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. At the start of this conflict, everyone was concerned about Russian Orlan 10s, these are their fixed wing drones, which are assigned to artillery units. And they've been very effective in previous conflicts. The Orlan 10, it's a military-grade drone. It's got a 10-foot wingspan, and it putters along on this two-stroke engine with a 12-hour flight time. And that gives it tremendous advantage in terms of being able to see what's happening on the battlefield. And because these are actually integrated with Russian artillery, it means rather than taking 10 minutes, 15 minutes to call down fire on a target, they're doing it in under 2 minutes. And that was making them very deadly. But since then, they've really been eclipsed by the number of small drones in the role. Orlan 10s have taken quite a lot of casualties, and they don't seem to have enough of them anymore. But these days, both sides are deploying small quadcopters literally by the thousand. The battery time is a real limitation. Basically, they fly them out, have 10 minutes viewing, then fly them back, change the batteries, and fly another one out. So that is a real problem. The Ukrainians would love to have more drones with longer duration, but they're doing a lot with the ones that they have.
I read a report by the RUSI recently that talked about attritional rates of drone use in Ukraine, and they threw out a figure of around 10,000, and they made sure to note that this was an arbitrary figure that they picked for effect because it varies with an average month to month. That is a huge number, even for consumer drones that are being churned out like the Mavic.
That is a huge and not entirely plausible number. Jack Watling has been putting ever since he put that in there, he has been putting out a lot of qualifications. Basically, this was a figure that a Ukrainian official gave him. For one thing, it's a very round number. For another thing, the Ukrainians themselves don't know how many drones there are out there or how many are being lost.
I suppose not. If there's people, they've crowdfunded them, they're getting them through various different avenues, and they're not all kept on an inventory.
It's not easy to estimate.
Armed forces, are they?
But back in March, there was one Ukrainian official who was saying they were losing about 300 to 400 a month. And if you look at the number of Russian drones, they claim to have destroyed about 2,000 over the entire conflict. Right. So I think that 10,000 number is overstating it, but it still gives you an idea of what's going on. We are definitely talking about many, many thousands of drones involved in the conflict, many, many thousands being brought down over the period of it. And those numbers are going to go way up. The Ukrainian military are now talking about buying, would you believe, 200,000 drones by the end of the year.
Wow.
And to put that in context, the US Army's plans are to buy about 2,000 small drones over the next 4 years. So they're really talking about absolutely unprecedented numbers. They're using them like ammunition. They are expendable.
Yeah, they are. It does seem that they're considering it as an expendable ordnance rather than an asset that needs to be overcautiously husbanded. Obviously, that varies with different types of drones. So other drones are more capable and need to be, husbanded in a different way. But stuff that they're making themselves, the DIY stuff, which is absolutely fascinating, and the smaller commercial drones, I can completely see the logic in using them in a way that is, fully accepting in that they are going to be lost within a period of time that's relatively short and might shock people that aren't familiar with their use.
And some of them, since last July, we've now started to see the rise of kamikaze drones, or loitering munitions, if you prefer. And these are
one-way munitions, as the
FPV
UK MOD
drones.
likes to call them.
They're slightly, yes. Honestly, they will do anything rather than use the word drone. But the racing FPV drones are originally designed for the sport of drone racing, which is where you have a load of obstacles and pilots race them around at very high speed. They can go more than 100 miles an hour, and they can go through small hoops and things. One of the standard tricks is flying it through someone's legs. They are extremely fast and agile. And they don't have all the clever electronics of something like a Mavic. They can't do obstacle avoidance. They won't do a stable hover, but they are cheap, and you can get kits to assemble them. So all you need to do is stick a bomb on one, and you have a loitering munition. The other interesting thing about them is that because they're designed for high speed, they've actually got quite powerful motors, so they can carry a significantly bigger warhead than a Mavic. One of the big problems with Mavics has been trying to use them to attack armored vehicles, because they don't carry something like a 500-gram payload maximum, and that's really quite challenging to take out a tank.
Yeah.
Whereas these FPV racers, you've got 1 kilo or 2 kilo warheads, so they're able to basically carry an RPG warhead on it.
Yeah,
so it
PG-7 warheads and that sort of thing. I've seen strapped to the front.
We're seeing a lot of these.
Yeah, it is fascinating. One thing I wanted to touch on there before we move on is the payload obviously varies with the machine that's being used. We've seen a whole range of different types of munition dropped from those commercial drones. We've seen hand grenades. We've seen stuff like RKG 3.
Yep.
Yeah. The fairly antiquated hand thrown anti-tank grenades, which have kind of had a new life by being dropped. I mean, if you go onto Twitter or social media or any of these websites, you see an inordinate number of drone videos every day. And a lot of the ones that we initially saw last year were impressive because they're dropping a grenade from 200 feet into an open hatch. And I think what was lost on a lot of people is they are probably mobility kill vehicles, which are being... the drone operator is kind of making sure of the vehicle with what's like a K kill. Like they're actually trying to knock it out completely. And a lot of people are thinking that drones doing that kind of drop of ammunition are, they're attacking active vehicles. And I don't think that's always the case. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think there's certainly two different things going on here. One is drone demolition, and wherever you get a mobility kill, whether you get a vehicle that hits a mine, or whether the engine packs up, or whether it gets knocked out by other means, the crew will typically leave it there, and normally it would get retrieved. But now, if it is within the range of drones, the Ukrainians have really perfected this tactic of sending out drones again and again, and they keep bombing it until they destroy it. So those are actual just demolitions of static vehicles. The vast majority of these cases are where someone has left a hatch open, which I gather crews tend to do when they're in a hurry. And the preferred tactic is to drop a grenade with a fair amount of explosive, sometimes a thermobaric one, into the open hatch and set the tank on fire. And that's really the only way of destroying them with munitions that small. But we are seeing some cases where they are actually taking on moving vehicles. I wrote a piece about this epic confrontation with a Russian tank. It was a T-80BV with the name Barkas on it. And this drone operator keeps going after it and bombing it with these small improvised shaped charges. The first one hits the reactive armor on the turret and does nothing. He then drops a series of them on the engine deck. Each time the tank commander is obviously trying to move out of the way. So it keeps repositioning. And on the fifth one, it actually starts a fire in the engine. And after that, the tank drives off and then stops. And then in the next bit of the video, you can see it's abandoned. So the next 3 strikes, the drone comes back, tries to drop bombs through the hatch until eventually it does, sets it off, destroys it. So it is certainly possible to destroy tanks with even these small DJI Mavic type drones. It's a ludicrous improvised weapon, but it works. And the counter drone defenses just don't seem to be enough to stop this from happening again and again. Having said that, there are much, much deadlier anti-tank drones out there. The Aerorozvedka, the Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance teams, they started out as a volunteer unit several years ago. They've gone through several mutations since then, but it's still basically a separate organization attached to the military, which specializes in drone warfare. And they've developed their own drones called R-18s. These are octocopters, so they're slightly bigger.
I know the ones you mean, yeah.
Right. And rather than just carrying one small VOG-17 or whatever, these carry 3 RKGs, RKG-3s. So the idea is you can line up on a tank, drop one, see where that lands, and then drop the next one and the next one. And they seem to have a very good hit rate, and that grenade is big enough to take out even full tanks. So that type of drone is far more effective than just the little one. So again, you've got diverging evolution in drones. So you've got one branch is going towards the bigger things with a hefty bomb load. The other one is just going to small expendable ones that you throw as many in as you need. And then you've got a third strand of these Kamikaze drones carrying a RPG-7 warhead or similar and sacrificing themselves in the process. But then we're seeing even more evolution out of that, because there's now a version of the FPV that rather than crashing into the target, it dive bombs it, which takes a certain amount of pilot skill at the moment, but it's quite likely that's going to get automated in the future. So you just put a dot on the target, tell it to go, and it will carry out a perfect dive bomb delivery. So we're seeing lots of evolution happening there. No one's got the perfect small drone bomb yet. It's interesting, the Ukrainians have actually been asking for American Rockeye cluster munitions. The idea being not to use them as cluster bombs, but to take out the submunition, because that's actually a purpose-designed, shape-charged anti-tank bomb that would do them very nicely. Because at the moment, as far as we know, there aren't any proper factory-made drone bombs out there. There's lots of Ukrainian volunteer groups who are making them with 3D printers and stuff. But we're not quite at the level of reliable mass-produced bombs yet. I have no doubt at all that's going to be coming fairly soon.
It would make the most sense in an evolutionary step, wouldn't it? From what I've seen online and via numerous social media channels, there's a huge range of different types of munitions being used and dropped by these drones, ranging from, as we mentioned, those hand grenades. Often, initially they were in like little. I've seen them in glass cups. I've seen them in plastic
the plastic cups. This is the most dangerous technique. Is where you stick a grenade, you pull the pin out, stick the grenade in a cup, attach it, and
rely on gravity to separate them. And the lever flip.
There is at least one video of the grenade falling out while they are attaching it to the drone and everyone running away. But yeah, that is a viable way of doing it. These days, they have slightly more sophisticated drop mechanisms. These are 3D printed things, and it's very neat because you can just attach it to a commercial drone, instant bomber, and it uses the drone's light. So you've got a remote control to turn on the drone's light. You do that to drop the bomb. Very neat arrangement. But there's this huge variety of munitions. The American 40mm M433, the Golden Egg, they like that one very much because that's got quite a good combined shade charge and fragmentation effect on it. They're also, for demolitions, they use these, it's RGT-27S, which is a Ukrainian-made thermobaric grenade. That's quite useful for destroying vehicles and for bunkers and trenches. We've also seen some Molotov cocktail type devices.
Yes.
And a thing called a Molotov balloon. And one that they should not be doing is dropping tear gas grenades, which again, both sides have done, which is violation of the rules of war. You can understand why they do it, but it sets you off down quite an unpleasant road if they do that. But all manner of different... I've tried to keep a database of all the different munitions I've seen, but there's just so many improvised ones. Basically, anything you can attach to a drone, someone has tried to drop off it at some point.
I've seen plastic bottles filled with fragmentation, cans as well.
Yeah, soft drinks cans.
Yeah, is one I've seen a number of times. And then one I saw the other day was quite an interesting one. It was a very long tube, white, with fins and a nose cone. And it seemed like it was either like a large thermobaric sort of charge, or it was a blast fragmentation charge, and it was dropped on a house. I don't know whether you've seen that one, but that one struck me as something quite large and not one you see quite often.
It's the Ukrainians also operate. This is moving up the scale from the R-18. They are operating quite a fleet of heavy drone bombers, which are hexcopters, octocopters, things with payload of up to 20 kilos. And typically they're dropping things like 82mm or 120mm mortar bombs. But on a few of them, they seem to drop a single large improvised bomb like the one you're describing, which has quite a significant explosive effect. But it's just very difficult to keep track of what is being dropped and how it's being built. But so we seem to have a real profusion of different designers all working in different directions. And this is what I mean by the fact of it being very much a bottom-up thing. These aren't weapons that are being issued by the state industries. These are things that people are developing. There's lots of groups. There's one Ukrainian group called Steel Hornets. They produce these bomb casings and then sell them on at cost, basically, to anyone in the military who wants them. You just need to add your own explosive to it. And I'm sure they are sharing information and coming up with perfected designs, and we're going to see just better and better and more effective drone munitions out there going forward.
One thing that occurs to me is where within sort of the Ukrainian army's brigade structure, where did these drone operations fit? So I know we have the smaller commercial teams and the teams that are operating the FPV drones, etc. But these quadcopters, the octocopters, I should say, they're larger, they're a bigger asset, they're a more expensive, more important asset, you could argue. And then you've also got the reconnaissance elements as well. So are they being held at a brigade level, or are they being used by battalions, or is it a company thing, or does that vary? Is it kind of not as structured as we might expect?
It varies hugely. The situation is quite chaotic. Aero Rozvidka is a separate entity. They send detachments out to help whoever needs help. Right. There are also, because it's drone acquisitions are done on a local level, you do get individual battalions, companies, and even squads who are asking for people to send them drones or acquiring their own drones, or in some cases even building them. So it's on a very chaotic and bottom-up basis at the moment. The Ukrainian High Command is not keen on small drones, bizarrely enough, but their Ministry of Digital Transformation is. So they've actually bypassed the military procurement structure, and the digital transformation people have this Army of Drones initiative, which is the one that's committed to fielding vast numbers of drones on the front line. There seems to be some kind of rapprochement between them, so that they're now working together. And the military have said they're going to have 60 drone assault companies, which are individual companies specifically equipped just with attack drones. And we've seen the pictures supposedly of the first one of these and what their equipment looks like. And they're equipped with, I think, 10 of the R-18 anti-tank octocopters and 18 even bigger, what are they called, Kajan, which are heavy lift bombers, plus several hundred FPV attack drones. So that might represent basically a support company. So rather than having an artillery company supporting your operation, you might have a drone assault company moved into that role. These are very fluid times. We're seeing everything evolving quite rapidly. There are a lot of different drones out there. And as I say, there's very little central coordination. It's very much a matter of people see something that works and they think, we'll do that. And they do, and it does.
In terms of Russia and their comparative use of drones, I know a lot of Western media and analysts have said that obviously it's not on the same level as Ukraine's utilization of drones. Do they have any kind of structure, or is it very much again on an ad hoc basis?
They do have a structure. But most of it is certainly the quadcopter stuff is all on an ad hoc basis. Now it's coming right from the very, very top now. Even Putin himself has said we need to have Russian-built quadcopters. We need to have them issued to every battalion, every company, and every squad. But unfortunately for him, their drone industry really isn't up to it. And we've seen repeatedly Russian companies keep getting Chinese parts or even entire Chinese drones, rebranding it as Russian and selling it to the military at a vastly inflated price. And there's so much chatter on Telegram about their failures on that. Having said that, there are a lot of Russian volunteer groups who are acquiring and assembling their own quadcopters, similar to the Ukrainian ones on a much smaller scale, but they get even more obstruction from senior commanders when they actually want to implement things, when they want to have a training program or try and issue things. There seems to be very limited support from command for that type of thing.
It does strike me that they obviously went into it with the more complex drones, for artillery spotting, etc. But we've also seen them approach their parties for drones like the shahids and such like from Iran.
Yes,
which they aren't necessarily a battlefield drone. I don't think I've seen them used against tactical targets in the field. It's been more of a weapon of like a strategic bomber almost. Kind of
absolutely, and this is supplementing Russia's ballistic and cruise missile attacks. It was interesting in the early days. There were several accounts from Ukraine suggesting that shahids were being used against the Ukrainian artillery, but that completely vanished. And presumably because of strategic decision, they have been used against bigger, longer range targets. Basically, they're targeting the Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. Rather than going for power stations, they were going for transformers and substations, because the Shahid has a warhead of something like 40 kilos. It can't take out a power station, but it can certainly take out a smaller distribution point.
And they'd be less defended as well, I would imagine.
Exactly, yeah. It's possible to put defense around your power plants, but not around everything. And reportedly, Russia has acquired several thousand of these. They are extremely cheap, so shooting them down becomes a real problem. And this is the asymmetric advantage of comparatively small, cheap drones, is that they're low cost, they're simple to make, and you can throw them in vast numbers. And, this is the first conflict where we've seen this type of use on either sides. You were saying that the Russians went into the war with, a fairly conservative drone force. They did, but that's the sort of drone force that every other army in the world, arguably barring the Israelis, is fielding at the moment. So everyone in NATO should be looking at this and taking lessons about what do we need to equip our forces with, and what are we going to do if we see several thousand loitering munitions coming in the other direction? Because currently there's really nothing capable of stopping them.
And that raises the question of countermeasures. So we've
Yes.
seen an increase in anti-drone weapons, those electromagnetic rifle type
Yes.
things and that sort of stuff. What other kind of methods have they been trying to use to combat this increasing drone threat on both sides?
As you say, jamming is the main method, and you get both. The Russians obviously have massive electronic warfare kit all the way along the front, and that's
both the more conventional, larger scale stuff.
So they've got the larger scale vehicle mounted systems, and then they have also been issuing increasing numbers of these highly directional anti-drone guns, which looks like a B-movie ray gun for taking out drones. Those seem to have been having some effect. You would have thought that commercial drones would not be able to fly at all in any kind of serious jamming environment, because when you know what frequency they operate on, it ought to be very easy to block them. And although they may be taking very heavy casualties, perhaps 10,000 a month, as has been suggested, obviously they are still flying and are still effective. It'll be interesting to see if that carries on. There was, speaking about on the lowest tactical level, there was some very interesting exchanges on Russian Telegram, and they've assembled advice on how to survive against Ukrainian drones. And there's this whole list of things about what you do when there are Ukrainian drones over your position.
Right.
The main thing is to stay very well hidden, make sure you're camouflaged, make sure you're not visible on thermal imaging, and don't move. And the slightly bizarre one, if you see a drone hovering overhead and dropping a bomb on you, what you have to do is lie on your back looking upwards, and when it drops the bomb, you roll away several times and then crouch in a fetal position.
I recall seeing some of the mobilized troops training to do that in some videos. Yeah, I do recall seeing that.
And it's not bad advice, but my God, it does suggest a severe inability to shoot down the incoming drones. One thing is that they basically say don't bother trying to shoot them down unless there are a lot of you and the drone is at low level, because they are exceedingly difficult targets. So that's
the cross sections
having limited effect. Particularly for the larger drones, your AAA is certainly having some effect. The German Shepards are certainly shooting down numbers of shahids, and we are seeing some other loitering munitions shot down. And surface-to-air missiles are very effective. You can shoot down a small quadcopter with a Patriot missile, and we know this because somebody did it. We think it was the Saudis. But using a $3 million missile to shoot down a $1,000 drone just isn't a sustainable approach.
I believe all lands have been taken out with British martlets and that sort of thing.
Yes,
which are quite that's quite expensive, but and all lands probably worth it, I would assume. That's quite
it's about 100. I mean, the Orland is 100K, so it might actually be cheaper than the Martlet. But in the tactical situation, it's worth more to get that thing knocked down, so it doesn't call down fire on you. The problem is, how many Martlets do you have against how many drones coming the other way? In the case of Orlands, we probably can shoot them all down. In the case of the quadcopters, you're certainly not going to take them out of missiles. You're going to run out of missiles long before we get there. So. And that again leads to this interesting thing of drone versus drone combat, which we have seen a few examples of. Typically, it's when a Ukrainian drone operator finds a Russian artillery observation drone somewhere near their positions, and they decide to have a go at it. And it's very much like World War I dogfighting, because it's all completely improvised. And they figured the way to do this is because the drones have their rotor blades on the top and the cameras facing downwards. You approach your enemy from above because he hasn't got upward looking cameras, so he doesn't see you, and you then descend very rapidly, and his rotor blade then contacts the body of your drone. That should be enough to break the rotors without damaging yours too badly, and you then watch him spin out of sight, and we've seen that done a few times. So that's something that a skilled drone operator can pull off if they know what they're doing. There's also a number of interceptor drones out there from companies like Fortem and anti-drone drones. And there are some of them. The company called Mars produces one, which is a ramming vehicle, which just flies into enemy drones. And with small ones, it will just shatter. With larger ones, it will go down itself, but it will take out the target. And Fortem one's actually armed with a net gun, so that's a reusable interceptor. And they claim to have been effective at taking out several different types of Russian drone. So I suspect we're going to see a lot more of those. And because those are, in principle, as affordable the drones as they're dealing with, you could see thousands of incoming drones met by thousands of interceptors. And this is going to turn into a World War II type aerial warfare of swarms of incoming bombers, possibly escorted by fighters, meeting lots of interceptors, and you see how many get through.
See, that's so interesting that it's taken an almost parallel sort of evolutionary path to something that was once manned. Speaking of nets there, we've seen a lot of nets being used. Yes. I've seen nets thrown across the tops of trenches and dugouts. I've seen them used around artillery pieces, and they seem to be effective.
We've seen a number of cases where there have been. This apparently this came out of an experience when there was a Ukrainian artillery position which was under camouflage netting, and a Russian Lancet loitering munition ran into the netting and was caught and didn't explode. And since then, we've seen very widespread use of nets, everything from fishing nets to chain link fence panels, all put around positions. They certainly do have some effect, and it's pretty good for a static position, not so easy for a moving vehicle. Though back in the early days, battleships did have anti-torpedo nets on booms that they carried around with them.
One question that always occurs to me is, how much do these drones cost? Because I know there's such a wide range and such a plethora of different designs that are in use, being DIY, off the shelf, and then more complex military-grade drones. I know it's a big question, but what kind of costs are we looking at here? Because we've talked about the scale of use, but cost is another factor.
Well, let me give you a price list, because this is an area which is dear to my heart. And in particular, the disparity between the costs of civilian and military drones. So right down at the bottom end, you can get an FPV attack drone, which the Ukrainian group Eskadron are making at the moment. Total cost is $492. So that's for a single-use loitering munition. Moving up slightly on the consumer side, you can get a DJI Mavic from say $700 for the cheaper ones, up to about $3,000 for the full-on one with all the kit. Then you see there's a bit of a jump to the next level. The R-18s, the big bomb-dropping anti-tank octocopters, those are quoted about $20,000 to $30,000 a piece.
That's a big jump.
If you want military-grade drones, get way more expensive than that. So the fixed-wing drones used for artillery spotting, the Russian Orlan 10 is about $100K. The ones on the Ukrainian side, the Lelica, Fury, Spectator, PD2, Stork, there's a whole load of them made by Ukrainian companies. You're typically looking in the 100 to 200K range. And if you want anything from America, you are similarly looking at fairly hefty price tags. And then at the top end, you've got something like the Bayraktar, which is like a small aircraft, which is not really bit smaller than the Predator, but very useful for long-range reconnaissance and can carry 4 laser-guided missiles, so quite handy. Those are about $5 million a throw. So it spans the full range. In theory, drones should be a lot cheaper than manned aircraft, but it doesn't necessarily work out like that. And particularly, unfortunately, in America and the UK, prices get cranked up and up. The UK has an unfortunate history with uncrewed aircraft programs and their costs. They were The British Army was at one point using Black Widow nano drones, which are these tiny, tiny little helicopters that will take off from the palm of your hand. And there are a few of those in Ukraine. Those used to cost something like 100K each. I think they're down to about something like 30K, but that is ludicrously out of scale compared to something like a Mavic. And if you go for the seriously big ones, like the American Global Hawk, you can then actually get up into hundreds of millions of dollars. So there is really a massive range of prices. As a rule, the military ones tend to get more expensive over time. The civil ones tend to get cheaper over time. So every year, DJI will bring out a new model that's slightly more capable than the last one for the same sort of price. So it's a very similar business model to smartphones. Whereas the military ones, as we know, have this famous Augustine's law that says that military systems go up geometrically in price generation on generation.
Yeah, I mean, the price factor must be a bit of a headache in terms of procurement for individuals and local groups, because they're crowdfunding. We're seeing a lot of charities trying to raise funds to provide them to individual units and that sort of thing. I know that the Ukrainians, the digital ministry you mentioned earlier, is looking at, creating an indigenous capability to manufacture all of these. But at the same time, they probably can't produce something like the Mavic at the scale that China can. So obviously that must be something that is a bit of a headache for them in terms of procurement and keeping up with that attritional rate as well.
Well, the bizarre thing is that nobody can produce them like DJI can anywhere in the world, which is why both sides, both the Russians and Ukrainians, are making incredibly heavy use of DJI quadcopters, while at the same time DJI is saying we don't accept that our product should be used for warfare, and they have banned sales to both anyone in Russia and anyone in Ukraine. So both sides are smuggling them through backdoor channels and buying them in third-party countries and shipping them there. But DJI, who produce literally millions of drones per year, they control 70% of the civil market. There's absolutely no one who can match that. The Americans have already spotted what a huge problem this is. Their military used to use a handful of DJI drones, partly for threat assessment and partly just because they were useful. There's now been orders gone round. They are banned from using DJI products because they do collect data which the company that makes them collects, and which could be handed over to the Chinese government if they ask it. So it would be quite possible for them to see where all their drones are operating. So the American government have what they call a blue SUAS, Small Unmanned Air System initiative, to produce American-made, totally certified, 100% secure drones. Those are several times the cost of the DJI equivalent, but they are military grade and they do have much better communications. So America will be producing those in quantities of thousands, but not tens or hundreds, thousands or millions. I think we're going to see a lot of people who are looking very carefully at how they can manufacture drones in bulk going forward.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a future consideration, it sounds like. Just moving away from that for a moment, I wanted to ask about the Russian Lancet drones, which are proving to be, quite effective.
They are terribly effective, yes. This is the Lancet 3. It's made by the Zala company, which is a subsidiary of Kalashnikov. The version we're seeing now, the 3M, it weighs something like 25 kilos, carries a 5 kilo warhead, and it's effective out to 40 kilometers. It's got a video camera in the nose. It's also got GPS. So mainly the way this operates, it flies to a designated area, and the operator then uses the camera to find the target, dive in on it, and destroy it. And according to Rusi, this is now Russia's main counter-battery weapon. They're more effective than artillery at taking out other artillery. There are lots of compilations of them taking out Ukrainian artillery, self-propelled guns, personnel carriers, tanks. There are at least a couple of them showing Lancets taking out Leopard tanks. And this really should give pause to armoured theorists, because it's easy enough to stop things like RPGs and ATGMs by suppressing the firing position, putting down smoke. maneuvering, that type of thing. But when you've got a munition which it's fired from beyond line of sight, so you can't suppress the firer, it's looking at you from above, so smoke or taking cover behind a ridge or whatever does you no good. And they are quite capable of hitting fast-moving targets. So there are no very satisfactory countermeasures at the moment. And also, because of its nature, it can be top attack or it can attack the rear or side armor of a vehicle. So these really are quite a serious challenge to main battle tanks and the whole theory of how they work and where you put your armor and what sort of protection you need. And to say, Lancet has been horribly effective. In theory, the Ukrainians do have an equivalent. The American-supplied Phoenix Ghost loitering munitions. We have seen absolutely zero evidence of those in use, which appears to be from operational security reasons, but we really don't know how effective those are going the other way. It would be fascinating to know. Another
system that has been, reportedly in use in Ukraine but hasn't been seen is the Switchblade 600s, which I believe have like a warhead sort of equivalent to Javelin, that sort of thing. But we've seen the 300s, but none of the 600s, I don't believe.
Absolutely. We don't know how many 600s have been supplied. And last time we talked to AeroVironment, they didn't say they'd supply them. I think there's one image which is claimed to be of a 600, but certainly that would be similarly effective. The issue with those is that those are likely to be in the region of $200,000 a piece. So that's, an anti-tank weapon for that price compared to $500 for a loitering munition carrying an anti-tank warhead. So you can have literally several hundred of one against one shot with the other. So it's easy to see how the small ones might turn out to be a better investment, even though obviously something like Switchblade 600, it's got jam-proof communications, it's got thermal imaging, it's got a better warhead, it's got all the bells and whistles. But it's still, at best, it's still only going to cause one kill.
Yes, it can only be in one place at one time. You can spread out a large number of drones to various different operators, can't you? And that adds another level of capability. I think one of the less talked about aspects of drones use in Ukraine is perhaps the psychological impact that they have on troops and vehicle crews, because not only do they have like an element of being capable of harassing an enemy, and the concept of the ever-present drone above,
the omnipresent eye in the sky watching you from above,
must be a factor.
I mean, we've seen quite a few reports from other conflicts. Particularly, we've seen them from Iraq and Afghanistan, and also from Palestinian sources about the demoralizing effect of having bigger drones watching you overhead all the time. But we've also seen a fair number of reports from Ukraine about the impact of being under constant drone bombardment. And there was a very interesting Russian description of the tactics the Ukrainians were using. Again, with small drones, they were just sending them several at a time, just waves of them, so there were always drones overhead. And they would use them to basically attack anything that moves. And they're saying the effect of this over the course of a few days, it means if you've got a defensive position, everyone stops moving. It makes it very difficult to resupply. It means you can't get casualties out. After a while, your batteries start to go flat. You run out of water. And basically everyone because you are stuck there with one eye looking upwards, it's extremely demoralizing. And they're saying there's cases where the defenders have been forced to retreat because they just found their position was untenable, not because they were taking heavy casualties, but simply because they were paralyzed and because the troops weren't willing to stay there and risk getting killed every time they moved. Well, so there is a tremendous morale effect going on there.
Yeah, well, there's the morale effect, and that has a knock-on effect of if a unit can't move, is it combat effective? It's not. It's another element of you don't need to be dropping ordnance on a position to almost neutralize it by the sound of it in some cases. I suppose that depends on the capability and the resilience of the troops that are being harassed, but it's still quite a factor. It must be pretty unnerving to know that you can be sat in a dugout and have an M67 hand grenade drop into your dugout, and not know about it. You know, it's
What's very interesting about in terms of the trench warfare aspect of this is we've seen time and time again drones dropping bombs into trenches and dugouts. And if you've got a foxhole, it's just a shallow grave because it gives them a way of targeting you. The only way to actually be safe from these constant drones overhead is not to be in a trench. You have to actually be in an underground bunker. And if everyone is sheltering the underground bunker, they're not really an effective fighting force. It's really because back in World War I days, during the artillery bombardments, people would climb down into the dugouts, and then as soon as the artillery ceased, they could get back up again because they knew that there wouldn't be an attack while artillery was actually landing on their position. With drones, it's different because it is actually possible to carry out attacks at the same time as drone bombing people, and we've seen close support videos where drones have been bombing Russians actually while they've been fighting against Ukrainian ground forces.
I was about to mention that exactly. So, you know, with the counteroffensive that's ongoing at the moment, we've seen a number of videos from a number of different brigades of those assault brigades, and they do seem to be using them not only as sort of an ISR element where they can talk to the platoon commanders and company commanders on the ground and tell them there's Russians at that end of the trench in this position, etc. But it also seems that if there's a position which is slowing down an assault, holding up an attack, I have seen a number of videos where, you know, the drone's been used to drop ordnance on those positions and, you know, help the momentum of that attack, you know.
Right, and because they are expendable, yes, they might lose quite a lot of drones doing that, but you just buy another batch the next day. Also on the psychological aspect, I read an interesting thing yesterday from a Russian group was saying that for their bombing missions, they use brightly colored drones because that way, whenever the Ukrainians see a brightly colored drone flying overhead, it means they have to take cover. And there's another one where people have been putting noisy rotors on their drones. So some of them, they have quieter rotors. Some of them you put noisy rotors on just to let the enemy know that you're there.
Very reminiscent of the Stuka siren.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure we will see something very equivalent to that coming up. I'm sure there will be noise-making drones.
Yeah. In a broader sense of the psychological impact, we saw a few weeks ago the attack on the Kremlin in Moscow with a couple of small drones. And that isn't obviously an element of harassment. That's more of a broader scale statement made by the use of drones and saying that we can strike with, you know, relative impunity at the most important aspects of, you know, Russian command and control.
Yeah, there were a couple of attacks on Moscow, both of which Ukraine has strenuously denied. It's worth mentioning. And really, we have no idea where they came from. I mean, they might conceivably have originated from Ukraine, in which case Russian air defense has got a lot of questions to answer about how slow aircraft can have traveled hundreds of kilometers through all the air defense around Ukraine, through all the rings of air defense around Moscow, right through into the Kremlin before exploding. I mean, it's possible. It would be staggeringly incompetent. It may be that they were launched from closer, if not actually inside Moscow, either by partisan groups or actually by Ukrainian groups inside Russia. So either way, it's interesting to know what's happening. But what we do know is that small drones do have a very long range potentially. Back in 2005, someone flew a hand-launched drone across the Atlantic from Canada to Ireland. I think so. And that is kind of a pointer to the future because in recent conflicts, particularly Western countries, we've been used to carrying out military operations in the Middle East or wherever, safe in the knowledge that the people we're fighting have no way of striking back at us. Well, now they do. And you're already seeing this in Yemen, where the Houthis, the rebels who don't have an air force of their own, are sending small drones, and they're attacking targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and hitting airports and things. And that's really quite a unsettling thing for people suddenly to find that they too are targets in this war.
Well, that leads me on to the question of where do you see the future of drones going? Because, well, two questions. what's the most innovative thing that you've seen in terms of drone use in Ukraine? And what do you see the future of drone use and drone warfare being?
I think the main thing to watch out for is they're going to get smarter. Because at the moment, the big limitation is the operator, and we're talking about FPV drones and dive bombing and other things. It really takes a level of operator skill to use them effectively. And even though you may have large numbers of drones, you're still limited to one drone per operator. So you can only fly a certain number of them at a time. Once you start getting smart drones that can fly themselves and can go off on missions and find their own targets, for one thing, that frees you of the one drone per operator limit. It means you can have unlimited number of drones. It also means that jamming becomes completely ineffective, because jamming relies on breaking the communication between the drone and the operator. If there's no operator, there's no link to jam. So you then find drones become very much harder to stop. Both sides are doing quite a lot of work on this. There are some interesting claims about the Lancet, which actually has an American-made chip in it, which is optimized for neural networks and machine learning, made by NVIDIA. And it is claimed that that has quite a high level of autonomy and is able to navigate autonomously and recognize targets autonomously. It's not clear whether they can do that with the level of processing they've got, but that certainly is possible with the next generation of processors, and those are already being flown in some of the drones that we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think you're going to see very much smarter, more dangerous and more capable drones coming together. And the other thing is that what that enables is swarms. So rather than having drones operating individually, you can have a group of them operating as a cooperative entity to fan out, search an area, and carry out an attack on a particular target to maximize their effectiveness. Lots of people are looking at drone swarms, including the British military, obviously, the Americans, the Chinese, the Israelis, and others. But I suspect we might see that used most likely by the Ukrainians, but possibly by the Russians in the next year or so. And of course, that was kind of the what my book, Swarm Troopers, builds up to, this idea that as drones get smaller and cheaper and you can field them in larger numbers, and as they get smarter, you can start putting them together into swarms of hundreds or thousands. And the US military is certainly already talking about operations involving swarms of thousands of drones at a time. That's really going to take things up several levels, and it's very hard to see what kind of impact a swarm of 1,000 drones could have on the modern battlefield. But I think it's going to be quite dramatic.
I think you're probably right. Absolutely fascinating, David. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been following the drone use in Ukraine, but I'm not a subject matter specialist in that area, so I wanted to speak to someone who's been looking at it a little bit more closely. So I would encourage everyone to check out David's articles and his book that he's just mentioned there, and I'll have a few links in the description box below for where you can find those. Again, David, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you about drone use, and it's been absolutely fascinating to learn some intricacies of how they're being used and what's probably going to be the developmental future of them. So yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, all that usual stuff. And thanks for watching.
Thank you.